This time, Kensington Palace in London is an intimate residence that houses today's modern royals. But it began as a new home for King William III and Queen Mary II in 1689. The brainchild of architect Sir Christopher Wren, its construction was state-of-the-art, and its design was the height of sophistication, making Kensington one of the world's greatest palaces. Two of the most famous royals in British history, Queen Victoria and Princess Diana, have both lived at Kensington Palace. Hidden away in London's Hyde Park, it began its life as an early 17th century Jacobean mansion before becoming a palace fit for the monarchy. Lee Prosser has been a curator here for over 15 years.
Kensington's grown very organically from its origin. It was never a grand palace. It was always a retreat, a very intimate place for the king and queen. And it started life as a little courtier's house, so a square block, if you like, quite modest. And then it was extended and extended and extended and extended over the years. And what that's left us with is a difficult labyrinth to navigate. And even people who work here have to think about where they're going if they want to get from one place to another, because there's no logic to it and it can be quite confusing. But it's a reflection of the way that the building's just grown piecemeal over the years, really.
Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill's story received more attention after the release of the Oscar-winning film, The Favourite.
I think to look at that relationship in modern terms and to suggest that they were lovers is wrong, because they perhaps would have seen their relationship in a different way. The contemporary accounts don't really tell us anything in that detail. They just infer it, and we can make of that what we will.
We do know that the film is absolutely right in portraying Sarah Churchill and her cousin Abigail Masham as fierce rivals for Anne's attention and for her affections. And indeed, this was really the source of a great fight between Anne and Sarah, which took place at Kensington Palace, which was never resolved.
I think what happened was that Sarah Churchill became more and more contemptuous of Queen Anne, and eventually spoke to her or snapped at her in a way that just crossed the line. And the Queen took offence, and Sarah was banished from court.
But away from the stresses and strains of her personal life, Queen Anne enjoyed her time at Kensington.
It was Anne's beloved house, it was Anne's great home, and really Kensington flowered under Anne, and the gardens in particular became the great gardens that they are now.
She also had the orangery built, which became one of the most distinctive features in the gardens at Kensington, and still is today.
The orangery is one of our architectural treasures. So this is a contribution by Queen Anne. And she had this built in 1705, ostensibly as a greenhouse, so a place for putting tender plants like oranges. But we know that she also used the building for ceremonies and for parties as well.
Anne was not known for spending large amounts of money at the palace, but for the orangery, she made an exception.
All of the archives seem to suggest that Anne spent very little on the garden and tried to reduce the expenditure. But this would have been quite an extensive and elaborate construction. And to collect all these wonderful citrus plants, trees and bushes would have been quite an undertaking and must have looked absolutely spectacular.
Orangeries had become popular across Europe in the 17th century, but the elaborate greenhouse at Kensington Palace was one of the first to be built in Britain. It is still unknown who exactly dreamt up the impressive structure.
Nicholas Hawksmoor, we think, designed the orangery. But there's an ongoing debate.
Plants and trees warm in the British winters. It's believed the early 18th century engineers used a system created by the ancient Romans.
We're not quite sure how the orangery at Kensington was heated, but in restorations they discovered flues running under the building to what must have been a distant furnace of some kind. So it seems to have had some kind of hot air ventilation system like a Roman hypocaust. The things that were used for heating Roman baths, where you had vaults underneath the floor in which hot air was pushed.
The glazier work in the orangery was state-of-the-art for 1705. Although it's unknown who designed the windows, they were clearly inspired by Sir Christopher Wren.
This is a very good example of one of those early sash windows that was so typical of Christopher Wren's work. So you have two sort of sliding sashes, one with 16 panes of glass and the lower one with 20 panes of glass. So these are of really epic proportions. And one of the most important historical things about them was that in 1705, when this building was constructed, window glass was expensive. So if you could afford to have very large panes of glass like this, it showed that you were wealthy. And of course, who is more wealthy than Queen Anne herself? So she has the biggest windows with the biggest panes of glass. But you also need these enormous sashes because you've got trees inside, so you need to admit the maximum amount of light. But these are so big and heavy, you need 2 or 3 people just to lift them. This is the only great legacy of Queen Anne at Kensington Palace, but what a legacy. It's a really important building. It's a beautiful building.